Hello. Today's lectures will concern the views of psychological and ethical egoism. As you can no doubt guess from the name, these are both views about the individual, more specifically about the self. And so we'll take a look at those in a couple of different contexts. And so the first thing to be aware of is that there, again, as you've seen at several other points in this course, there are two kinds of egoism here. There's what we call psychological egoism and what we call ethical egoism, and these are very different views. They have different chapters in the text, and they'll follow a kind of divide that we've seen in other parts of the course. Psychological egoism is a descriptive view, and therefore it is not ultimately a theory about morality, right? Psychological egoism is a statement about what, as a matter of fact, people's psychologies are like, namely that people's psychologies are egoistic. Ethical egoism is going to be a different claim. It's going to be the normative claim. That's actually going to be the theory about morality. That's going to be the theory about what we ought to do or ought not to do, or what's morally right or morally wrong, in other words. So if you'd like a definition, psychological egoism is the view that, as a matter of fact, all actions are due to self-serving motivations, and all motivations are ultimately selfish, right? Or self-interested if you don't like the word selfish, right? That's all we mean by that in this context. Whereas ethical egoism is the view that the only moral duty that anyone has is to improve their own well-being, or in other words, to act in their own self-interest, right? So look at these two claims, and it becomes pretty easy to see how one of them is a claim about what, as a matter of fact, people's psychologies and motivations are like, and the other is a claim about what people ought to do, right? What is morally right or morally wrong. So you've gotten used to by now the fact that, for the most part, we really only care about the normative claim here in ethics because we're doing a normative project. We're interested in these kinds of normative questions. What should we do? What should we what are the best views? What is the best life for a person to lead? What is morally right? What is morally wrong? Those are the questions we are interested in ethics. But we will have to take a look at psychological egoism for a very particular reason. The reason for that is that, for the most part, it seems plausible that the way the principle is stated, that ought implies can, right? And so what we mean by that is that if you have some kind of a moral duty, if someone wants to say you ought to do this, that, or the other thing, it seems like you can't have some duty to do something that is impossible. Someone says you ought to, fly to the moon or something like that. They can't be entirely serious about that because, of course, you can't fly to the moon. I actually have my doubts about this doctrine. I think there are some places, some specific circumstances in which, a moral duty can apply, even in cases where there's no possibility of fulfilling that duty. I still think people can have certain duties under those circumstances, but for the most part, I think it's plausible to say that if somebody has a duty, then they should also have the ability to fulfill that duty. Otherwise, they don't really have the duty, right? You can't have a duty to do something that's not possible to do, in the general case. And so what the idea is behind psychological egoism is that if it's true, okay, if it's true that we are completely incapable, like there is really no such thing as an other regarding motive, right, as a motive that might help somebody else, or a motive that's not ultimately self-interested, if that's the case, if those are the only kinds of motivations we can have, then requiring people to sometimes have other kinds of motivations would seem wrong, right? It would seem like that would be that would be a violation of this ought implies can principle, right? We would be expecting people to do something that they in fact can't do, right? So for that reason, we really should examine psychological egoism. And so let's take a look at it. Let's see how good of a view this is. Now, Schifferlando presents a number of arguments in favor of psychological egoism and presents some of the difficulties with that. His discussion is fantastic, and I don't want to clomp all over it, but I do want to bring out a couple of little highlights here. So the first is, what he calls something like the motivation argument, right? And the nutshell version of this is that in general, you always do what you want to do, so everything that you do is ultimately about what you want, right? So this is an argument that attempts to say all of our motivations are ultimately internal, right? Every motivation you ever had came from you. So that means that, everything is ultimately about what you want. Now that when you read it that way, it looks like something that just must be obviously true and trivially simply true, but it's not actually true when you pay closer attention to it. It equivocates between the source of the motivation and its content. Okay, it's trivially true, yes, that all of your motives are yours, right? All motives are internal in that sense, but that doesn't mean that all motives are toward self-interest. Okay, so yes, all of your motives are your motives, but that doesn't mean all of your motives are geared only toward your own self-interest, right? So again, I think there's a difference between the source of the motivation and the content of the motivation, and so that's just a subtlety that gets missed in this particular argument in favor of psychological egoism. Another argument that Schiffer-Landau mentions in some detail is something that I'll call here the benefit argument, right? This is the idea that there is always some benefit, right, to you in your every act, whether you think so or not. Okay, so you might imagine all kinds of examples where people say, oh look, I was trying to I was trying to help that old lady across the street, and he's like, oh, well, you're only doing that so that you could look good to your neighbors, or so that you could gain the appreciation of this old lady and maybe get into her will or something. I mean, I don't know, crazy things like that. But that's the idea. This is the way that this argument works, is to try and suss out any possible benefit you might have gotten from any possible act, even if that act did benefit somebody else, and say, aha, but there's that selfish motive in there, right? And it seems like there's often room to do this because, again, even some things that are largely unselfish sometimes do have benefits to us. For example, somebody who decides to do business honestly in all things, that's of course the right thing to do, and that does benefit all the people they do business with. But it's also a pretty good business practice. It also benefits the business. So it's one of those things where again, there's a lot of room sometimes to make this kind of an argument, but nevertheless, it's not a great argument. So aside from being untrue, right, that there is always some benefit, the way that this sort of thing is often phrased, it's this sort of whether you think so or not aspect of it, turns it into a kind of self-sealing argument, right? And so the trouble with hidden motivations or sort of repressed things in your psychology is that you can't ever, offer any evidence to the contrary. And so, if you were to tell the purveyor of this argument, oh gosh, you're right, everything I do is for my own, in my own self-interest, they'd say, aha, I told you so, right? And if you were to say, I don't think there was any of my own, anything that benefited me in this particular action that I just took, and they'd say, aha, that proves it, right? You're just, you want so badly to be this, righteous, virtuous person that you would just make up the fact that you didn't benefit at all, right? And that's how you benefited, or something like that. It's a little bit tortured. So that's a self-sealing argument, is one that to which no refutation is possible, or contrary evidence simply becomes part of the evidence. This is a common feature among conspiracy theories, right? This is the line, that's what they want you to think, right? So any contrary evidence is, oh, that's what they want you to think, right? And that's, again, it's a crummy argument. And again, I think one can think of plenty of acceptable counterexamples here. I think, think of, in your own life, of the number of things, probably even very trivial things, that you did that helped somebody else, didn't help you at all. Like holding the door open for some stranger behind you. You may never see that person again in your entire life, right? It's really hard to imagine how that small act could ever benefit you in any way. And yet, you did it anyway, right? There are all kinds of just actions of basically being a decent human being have something like this character, making something a little bit easier for somebody else, and there's no really benefit to you. It's just, that's how you live in a society. So in any case, I wanted to say something about a specific version of the benefit argument, and that's the version that says, when you help somebody else, you're only doing it to make yourself feel good. Okay, And this one has seemed very persuasive to a lot of people over the years. So the idea is like, well, gosh, I guess that's true. I mean, and don't you feel good when you do the right thing, right? Don't you feel good when you help somebody else, right? And so it seems that the psychological egoist tries to take that feeling and turn it into some sort of evidence for their view that, again, ultimately your motives are all self-interested. Now, the trouble is that this is an argument that the psychological egoist cannot make, okay? And the reason for that is that if it is impossible to be motivated by helping others, okay, then what's there to feel good about in helping others, right? Like, what is the source of the good feeling if you cannot possibly, imagine what actually helping somebody else would be like, or that helping somebody else might be good, right? I mean, what it leaves something pretty important out, right? The reason that you feel good for helping somebody else is because you helped somebody else, right? And that's the good thing. And then the feeling good is an effect, not a cause. There's an old story which is I'm quite sure not true, and it involves Abraham Lincoln. And why it involves Abraham Lincoln, I have no idea, because he was not exactly known as some sort of an egoist or something. But this is how the story goes: that Lincoln is riding in a coach with one of his friends, and they're talking about how they're talking about psychological egoism in a sense, right? They're Lincoln is advancing this argument that all motivations are ultimately selfish, and while they're rolling along, the wagon rolls over I think usually in the story it's a pig that manages to get one of its legs underneath the wagon wheel, breaks the leg, and this pig's just squealing and carrying on, and the wagon continues on for a little while. Then Lincoln says, all right, hold it, stop the coach, right? Gets out of the thing, puts the pig out of its misery, and comes back into the wagon, and the friend says, aha, see, why did you do that, right? What's the self-interest to you? And he says, well, what kind of a person would I have been if I just let the thing suffer? So of course I did it for me, right? Well, now of course this undermines the very idea of psychological egoism. If there wasn't anything good, right, about considering somebody else's suffering, then what kind of satisfaction could you have gotten out of it for your own benefit, right? And so that's the trouble with this argument here. Is sort of it mixes up what depends on what here. Also, there are just so many counterexamples to psychological egoism. In fact, our author Schaefer Landau begins the chapter by detailing many selfless acts of sacrifice that people perform routinely, right? You can fill entire books, and people have filled entire books full of these kinds of things. Nearly everybody, who's ever been in, armed conflict has at least one story of somebody, very selflessly sacrificing themselves for their fellows. And it's, again, it's tremendously common. People who are, relatives, strangers, people, in families sacrifice for each other all the time. I mean, again, you can talk about sort of monumentally selfless acts of sacrifice, and you can talk about very small, very everyday kinds of acts of sacrifice that people do for each other all the time, right? And it's just not so easy to explain them all away, and ends up being too intellectually simple. But actually, ironically, one of the most clear examples, I think, in addition to all of these, very selfless acts of sacrifice, and I think something that a lot of people, I think, forget to bring up as counterexamples to psychological egoism, are all the ways in which we have very negative other regarding motivations, right? I mean, consider, for example, revenge. Okay, this is a very common thing. Some people, of course, are consumed by a need for revenge, but it's a very natural human thing. If you talk to therapists, they'll tell you all about all the people who are, really, trying to get over various kinds of feelings of revenge. They feel very hard done by. They feel like somebody deserves punishment for this, that, or the other thing. And one of the things that's very common when people get a little carried away here is that most often acts of revenge are pretty self-destructive, right? That is, and think about how we're phrasing this here. That is, people are sacrificing their own self-interest just to make sure that somebody else does badly, right? Notice that's the other side of the coin of ignoring your own self-interest in order to benefit somebody else. We also ignore our own self-interest on occasion to harm other people. Maybe, it's an empirical question, which of these things we actually do more often. I tend to think we actually do the good one more often, but even we might want to do them both equally. So again, you can imagine all kinds of all kinds of examples, and in fact, therapists who deal with people who are very consumed by these kinds of revenge things have a common refrain. They say people get more focused on trying to hurt somebody else than they are in trying to help themselves. Which, if there's not a statement that shows the lie to psychological egoism, I'm not sure what it is. And so our verdict on psychological egoism has to be, that it's just not plausible. Okay, there are not really good arguments establishing its truth, and there are lots and lots and lots of perfectly reasonable counterexamples to the idea that all actions are exclusively self-interested. Right, that just doesn't appear to be true, and any version of it that does have some plausibility turns out to be a little bit too intellectually simple to stand up to scrutiny. So we then turn our attention to our bigger concern, honestly, the concern of ethical egoism. So remember, this is the theory of morality, right? This is this is what we're going to be interested in. This is the view that one's only moral duty is to promote one's own interests, right? That is to promote one's own well-being, to do what is best for the individual, right? For the one doing the action, right? Now, it's worth noting that ethical egoism does not prohibit a person morally from helping somebody else. It doesn't say you can't help anybody else, right? But it does maintain that the only thing you have to do, morally speaking, is benefit your own well-being, right? That's what the view says. It says that what's moral is whatever is good for you, right? Notice, not whatever you want or whatever you think you want, right? That's more close to subjectivism. This is you have a duty to do what is best for you. So if you have the wrong idea of what's best for you, you can still do the wrong thing, even if you think you're doing what's best for you, right? You can still be mistaken in that case. But what is actually your duty is to do what is actually best for you. That's the ethical egoist view, and that's your only moral duty. That's the other thing. So, of course, we have to take a look at this view and take a look at it very carefully to see if it's a good view. Some of the major arguments, some of the most popular arguments in favor of this, Schaefer-Landau mentions this connection as well, are connected with some of the novels of Ayn Rand, born Alyssa Rosenbaum, who's a Russian-American writer who, again, wrote some fairly well-known novels and some other essays and things, and popularized some kinds of arguments in favor of things like ethical egoism and some versions of political libertarianism. So some of those arguments, that again Schaefer-Landau addresses as well as I'll address here, are they have the same sort of feature, right? They have both of the popular arguments that, again, Schaefer-Landau addresses in much better detail than I'm going to do here, have the sort of same problem. I really wanted to highlight this particular problem that both of these arguments have. And that is the problem that they cannot actually be furthered by egoists. So, for example, if you look at the self-reliance argument in the text, and look at the second premise, it says we ought to take the most effective path to making everyone better off. Well, notice that's the kind of claim that an ethical egoist could not make, right? Because it appeals to what's better for everybody, not just what's better for each individual in each acting individual, right? That's, again, ethical egoism is the view that one's only moral duty is to benefit oneself. Okay, and so trying to adopt a premise that says you should do the thing that makes everybody better off is that's not a premise that an egoist can accept. The rest of the argument, of course, goes something like, having everybody mind their own business is the best way to make things good for everybody. We should make things good for everybody, so we should all be egoists, right? But of course, the reason to be an egoist is not to make things better for everybody, right? That's again antithetical to egoism, and so again the argument falls apart there. The libertarian argument appeals to various kinds of duties from consent, from contract, right, and from reparation. They said, look, if you have harmed somebody, then you owe them something. Not until then. That's a reparation. Or they say, if you have promised something, right, that's contract, right? Or if you have sort of agreed to something, that's consent. Okay, they say those are the only circumstances under which you owe anything else to anybody. Otherwise, your only duty is self-interest. Okay. And you can see how that set of ideas really comes out of something like ethical egoism. Again, the trouble is that consent, contract, and reparation are things that ethical egoists can't themselves accept. Okay, so for example, if you make a contract with somebody, make an agreement with them, that means you owe them something, right? And that's not something an ethical egoist could support. They'd say, well, you owe somebody something only if it actually benefits you, or you owe someone reparation only if it benefits you, right? And that's so again, it's not these aren't appeals that egoists can actually make. Some things to be said in favor of ethical egoism. It is at least an objective view, right? Whatever there is, whatever your options are, some of your options are objectively better for you than others, right? There is something, your interest is a real thing, your well-being is a real thing, and there are some things that make your life go better for you, and there are some things that do not. And if ethical egoism requires you to do the things that make your life better for you, it is actually at least it's objective, right? We can say so that it has that over, say, subjectivism or cultural relativism, et cetera, or any kind of ethics based on some form of authority. Also, Schaefer-Landau points out that another thing to be said for ethical egoism is that it does seem to have a persuasive answer to the question, why be moral? It's a very old, very important question in ethics. Why be moral? What's in it for me? Well, if what's in it for you is your own well-being, well, it seems plausible. It seems persuasive at least. Seems like a pretty good reason to be moral. Or is it? Remember earlier in this course, we have identified divine reward and punishment as an insufficient motivation for morality. Okay, I mean, if you think about it in the sense that, again, if you imagine you're the parent of a child, and you notice one of your children being really nice to one of their siblings, and you praise them for that. You say, hey, good for you being really nice to your sibling. And they say, well, I was hoping I would get candy for that, and that's why I was so nice. I imagine you'd be a little disappointed. You'd be like, oh, well, that sort of misses the point of being kind, of being moral here. And so when someone, when the main question is what's in it for me, right, I mean, when that's the main question, you wonder if somebody isn't missing the point of morality. And I think we've seen other kinds of examples where that's the case, where if it's just the rewards and punishments and that's all a person cares about. I mean, honestly, we have words for these people. We call them sociopaths. We think of it as an actual disorder, whereas if people are completely unconcerned with others and have nothing in mind except rewards or punishments to themselves, and that's the only thing they consider, again, we think of that as a kind of mental illness, not to mention a giant moral failing. And again, we as children, when children behave this way, we hope they grow out of it, right? And when adults behave this way, we hope they grow out of it. So that's the same thing applies here. If the answer to why be moral is because there's a payoff for you, right? There seem to be better reasons to be moral. This also indicates that self-interest alone doesn't really provide, these sort of considerations indicate that self-interest alone just doesn't provide an ultimately satisfying answer to the question, why be moral? Okay, it's like, because it's in your self-interest. It's like, well, I mean, or because you get your self-interest out of it or something like that. Aristotle ultimately says a very different thing that we'll encounter much later in the course. Aristotle will argue that it is in your interest to be moral, but that's the exact reverse of the egoist's claim here, which says that doing what is in your interest, right, is being moral. mixes up what depends on what, right? Aristotle thought that the virtues would tend to make you a better person, would tend to make you live a kind of life that really was better. And here we say just it's not the virtues that make your life better. It's making your life as good as it can be that is virtue, and that's seems exactly backward. In addition, we see many kinds of counterexamples, very common kinds of counterexamples to ethical egoism, cases where we can think of again, very, very common, easy situations that seem to fly in the face of what ethical egoism tells us. The most common counterexamples to ethical egoism are collectively termed easy rescue cases. I think you'll see why they're called that. Philosophers are really good at naming things. Okay, and so what's common to all these cases is they're cases of easy rescue, right? It's to imagine that person A can take some trivial action, like reaching out a stick or helping somebody up or calling out, "Hey there," right? I mean, something easy, right? Some trivial action in order to spare person B some grievous harm or death or something like that. And so the question is, in such cases, does A have a moral duty to do something? Okay, and for the most part, it seems pretty clear that that is the case. And so, imagine that you're standing here, and this fellow here is standing next to this giant vehicle with a big roller and spikes on it, and you notice that somebody's getting ready to start up this big old machine. Do you have some duty to say to do something, at least to say something like, "Hey, man, might want to get away from those spikes," right? And if you didn't do any such thing, wouldn't that be wrong? I mean, wouldn't that have been a kind of violation of moral duty? Wouldn't you, couldn't you be morally blamed for such a thing? And again, if you don't like this example, fine when you do. I imagine it wouldn't be that hard. But in general, these easy rescue cases are, I would say, the most common and most obvious counterexamples to what the egoist is telling us. Is like, no, we do have at least some duties to other people, even if we're going to put a pretty low bar on this. If you're curious, this giant machine is a tree crusher, and you're thinking to yourself, why would anybody want to crush a tree? What did they use this for, the filming of Fern Gully? Right? It's like, no, that was animated. Wouldn't need to build a real machine for that. No, they used it as part of the Vietnam War to just like clear out big patches of trees because yeah. Anyway, so in addition to some of those easy rescue cases, it seems like egoism leads to a kind of violation of some of our very most core moral beliefs. Again, the fact that some issues in ethics are very, very difficult doesn't mean that all issues in ethics are difficult, right? Some of the cases are actually fairly easy, even if there are, again, plenty of hard cases. And so ethical egoism, for example, would say that we have no moral duty in these easy rescue cases. That seems wrong. Also seeming wrong is the other side of the coin, that it would also say that we have a moral duty to kill, rape, torture, or humiliate whenever doing so best serves self-interest. Of course, that's a direct quote from our text, and that's, I couldn't have put it better myself, which is why I didn't. That's why I quoted Schaefer-Landau here. And it's hard to state the problem more plainly than that, right? If your only duty is for your own well-being, then whenever your own well-being would be served by, or best served by, killing, raping, torturing, humiliating, whatever, then it's not just that you're allowed to do those things, you'd be morally required to, and that seems like there shouldn't ever be a moral requirement to do any of those things, right? If there should ever be a moral requirement with regard to, rape and torture, just to pick a couple, it should be an absolute prohibition on those kinds of things. So anyway, that's a pretty strong indication that we're dealing with a moral theory that's not very good. Also, something that we tend to think of as being, very basic to an understanding of morality is the idea of rights. The idea that some people have legitimate claims to, a certain kind of treatment or a certain kind of expectation. And the fact that rights and duties relate to each other in a particular way. Okay, so for example, if I have the right not to be beaten up, that means that everybody else has a duty not to beat me up. Okay, and if everybody has a duty not to steal my things, then I have a right not to be stolen from. Okay, that's just the way that rights and duties work. If somebody has a right to something, it means that somebody else has some kind of a duty, and if somebody has a duty, it means that somebody else has some kind of a right. So we see this all the time in contracts or other kinds of agreements or promises, right? So if Biff promises to give Chuck $5 in exchange for a taco, okay, and Chuck supplies the taco, Biff has a duty to give the $5 to Chuck, and Chuck has a right to be given that $5. Okay, again, the basic interrelation of rights and duties just seem to work that way. And the trouble is, in an egoist framework, these kinds of rights are not allowed, okay, because the duties that they imply are not duties to self-interest. Okay, the basic idea of a contract or honoring a contract goes out the window because it's not always in your interest to fulfill the terms of a contract. In fact, it's very frequently not in your interest to fulfill all the terms of a contract, especially if the other party fulfills their end first, right? And so that's a pretty unfortunate part of that. Also, if you want various kinds of, again, very basic rights like the right not to be beaten up, the right not to be stolen from, the right not to be killed. If you want any of those rights, you have to grant that other people have duties not to kill you, duties not to steal from you, and duties not to beat you up. And of course, those are not part of the general egoist framework. In fact, you only have the duties to do those things when it serves your self-interest to follow those duties, but not universally. So that's another major blow. But there are actually even bigger problems, believe it or not, with ethical egoism as a moral theory. So again, just being an objective theory isn't quite enough to make it something a good moral theory, although it's a start. There's a lot of major trouble here. As it turns out, ethical egoism is one of the very most arbitrary of moral theories. So think of this, right? Just as a quick thought experiment. Think of examples in which someone divides up the world into two groups, right? And then asserts that one group has no legitimate interests and no moral standing, like that morally speaking, they don't matter. Okay? You can probably think of some historical cases in which something like this has gone on. You can probably imagine some cases from fiction where this sort of thing has gone on. And if not, you can probably just imagine some, what things might be like or who might say something like this. Okay. The question is, in fact, you can pause this now, think about it for a minute, right? What kinds of examples are you really thinking of here? Right? Make a really good effort for this one. Okay. The question is then, are you thinking of any morally good cases? Right? Are you thinking of things that you're like, oh yeah, that was awesome, that was great, that was perfect, it was totally appropriate? Probably not, right? You're probably thinking of things like, like Nazism. You're probably, thinking of things like slavery, racism. You're probably, thinking of genocides, ethnic warfare. You're thinking of some of the very worst moral examples in our species history, and those are the examples that most clearly fit into that category. But that's just exactly what egoism does in a way that's not entirely obvious until you point it out. Egoism divides the world into self, okay, and others, two groups, and treats the interest of only the first group as arbitrarily special and the interest of the second group as irrelevant, right? So in order to be an egoist, you fundamentally have to believe that your interests are special, right? That you have moral worth, that nobody else does. And that's, this goes beyond, right, egoism being a bad moral theory. When you put it this way, seems like the very statement of what it is to be evil. So I'm trying not to overstate that, but I can think of no better definition of evil than dividing the world into self and others and saying self, privileged moral importance, others no moral standing whatsoever. I mean, again, that rises to the level of like comic book villain, past even most comic book villains. Even some of them are even almost understandable in terms of their motivations. I struggle to think of any real actual people who even got that bad. Yeah. So anyway, it's pretty bad. All right, so if that's not bad enough, I do want to draw some other parallels to some of the other things that we've talked about in terms of what has made some of the other ethical theories problematic. If you've noticed, other bad moral theories tend to have had the problem of making moral reasoning and moral advice bizarre or impossible. Right. So, for example, in cultural relativism, there's no such thing as moral reasoning. You just say, what does my culture say to do? And then you do that thing. That's not reasoning. Right. And moral advice is sort of impossible because people are like, what do you want from me? You just do what your culture tells you to do if that's just what morality is. Or, subjectivism has problem both of these. Right. If you just do whatever it is you think you should do, well, there's no such thing as reasoning there either. And moral advice is completely absurd in a subjectivist framework, et cetera. So we've seen this sort of over and over. Again, now think of what moral advice would look like in an egoist framework, right? And it would take on some very bizarre characteristics. Okay, so if you ask somebody for moral advice within an egoist framework, you say, boy, grandpa, say, I really don't know what to do here. I'm trying to do the right thing. I've got these kinds of options, and it seems like, I'm having a real hard time with this one. Want to do the right thing. Now, it would seem like grandpa's duty would be to tell you how to best serve your own interest, because that's what egoism says to do, is serve your own interest. But actually, what grandpa's duty would be to give you the kind of advice that would serve grandpa's interests, not yours, right? Because this is egoism we're talking about, and that's highly, highly bizarre. And so, again, it's a very common issue among bad moral theories that they don't make good sense of moral reasoning and moral advice, and that is also an issue with ethical egoism. Right. So to conclude things up, okay, psychological egoism, which we started the talk with, is implausible, right, as a descriptive view, and so isn't going to really stop us from doing some very ordinary kinds of moral reasoning. And ethical egoism as a moral theory is pretty darn bad. So we're going to have to reject it and frankly look for something else. And so that's essentially what the next section of the course will do. We'll start to present some ideas about morality, about what makes something right or wrong. That is, we'll present a couple of moral theories that, even though they do have some problems, the problems they have are nothing like the problems with the ideas we've seen so far. Right, and so we're gonna abandon subjectivism, relativism, the defined command theory, ethical egoism, and we're gonna go ahead and take a look at some much more promising candidates in the weeks to come.